which are rummaging in the rubble looking for the bodies to eat them. It's as ugly as that, James. And during the daytime, the families whose houses these are scrambling around in the rubble. I asked one family what they were looking for. They said they only wanted to recover their family photographs, the graduation photographs of their children and their own wedding photographs. That's all they hope to find in that rubble.
It's right to say, isn't it, George, that Beirut in particular is a very westernized city, that people were living a very westernized lifestyle. Some people have told me, I've never been there, it's almost like being in the south of France.
Yes, indeed. Along the Corniche, along the Mediterranean, you have a promenade of many, many miles, which thousands of Beirutis like to walk in the morning and late in the evening. And you could be in Nice very easily, except it's more lovely in Beirut, because behind the city are very high mountains, where right up until the heat of the summer, they're capped by snow. That's the origin of the legend, and it's a true one, that you could ski in the mountains in the morning in Lebanon and water ski in the Mediterranean in the afternoon, having an afternoon at the beach.
Not much of that going on now.
It's a highly developed city. It's a capital city, and of course, it's also the center of a really horrific war zone.
Now, the Israelis said that they avoided targeting any buildings that weren't, they hoped, being lived in by people other than terrorists. Do you think they did? Do you think that they were selective in their bombing?
Well, it's better if I rely on less biased commentators than me. Save the Children Fund, whose patron is Her Royal Highness, the Princess Anne, said that 45% of the casualties inflicted by Israel were children, and a considerable proportion of the other 65% were 55% were women. So according to the Save the Children Fund, the great majority of casualties were women and children. And you only have to look at the buildings, and anyone who's seen the pictures knows. If you fire missiles and rockets and bombs at multi-story flats, how can you possibly be targeting only military targets? Another important voice in this is Amnesty International. Again, not a Hezbollah front, and frankly, no particular friend of mine. They said yesterday that Israel was undoubtedly guilty of war crimes and should be prosecuted for those war crimes. The United States itself, which supplies all the weapons to Israel, has begun an investigation into United Nations reports that they were using cluster bombs illegally in civilian areas, which is itself a specific war crime. And the United Nations has found literally hundreds and hundreds of unexploded bomblets, which effectively now are landmines lying unexploded amongst the rubble in civilian areas in Lebanon. So Israel took a beating on the battlefield here, at least according to their own commentators and the Economist front page, but it also took a very considerable beating to its international image.
A number of emails coming in, and we're about ready to go to the cause, George, but a number of emails coming in saying, George, when are you going to Haifa? When will you be going to Israel? Are you not concerned about the people who've been killed in Israel as well?
Yes, I am. But there were 30 times more casualties in Lebanon than there were in Israel, number one. Number two, the casualties inflicted by the Lebanese resistance were overwhelmingly military casualties. The casualties inflicted by the Israeli military were overwhelmingly civilian casualties. These are two very important differences. And, of course, I'm welcome in Lebanon. I'm certainly not welcome in Israel. But if we get a guarantee of safe passage, that we'll be looked after, and that will not be harmed, then maybe Big James Whale and I will take a trip to Haifa in the near future.
Thanks for that, George. Shall we take some calls, all right? First off, this evening on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway, it's Nicholas, who's in the very beautiful town city, is Canterbury, I think it is a city. Nicholas.
Yes, please.
Yeah, you're on the air, Nicholas. Speak live to George Galloway, who's in bombed-out Beirut.
Hello, George. This is just to say thank you to you for bringing us news from the front line. We appreciate this very much. I would just like to have your opinion on the accountability, the question of accountability in international law of Tony Blair personally for some of these very deplorable incidents. The use of cluster bombs, allowing UK airspace to be used for aircraft which are going to replenish the Israeli army with illegal weapons. How can we translate this into a form of conviction in law?
Well, thank you, Nicholas. I think you've put your finger on a really important issue. These weapons that Israel was firing were transshipped through British airports. One of them, I'm sorry to say, in Scotland, at Prestwick Airport, others through military bases on our soil, and therefore our government now has legal culpability in some of these alleged war crimes. And the fact that the Hezbollah and a very considerable amount of Lebanese public opinion has made it clear that Mr. Blair is not welcome in Lebanon, because you'll know that he fancies himself as a bit of a mediator in all this, although how he imagines he could possibly be an honest broker is beyond most people. But if he comes to Lebanon, he'll be in danger, and he would be better not to come here. The question is how we hold him to account. And I'll tell you why I think we can, Nicholas. On the 23rd of September, next month, I believe there'll be 1 million people. There's a prediction for you. 1 million people demonstrating in Manchester on the opening weekend of the Labour Party conference under the slogan, "Time to go." Time to go from Britain's role in occupations, but time to go for Tony Blair. I don't believe that we'll ever succeed through the courts in holding him to account, but if 1 million people turn up in Manchester and if the Labour Party does its job, this could be the last days of Tony Blair. This Lebanon war could be the last straw, the one that broke the camel's back.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas, very much indeed. 08704 20 20 20. This is the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway. I'm James Well, just looking after a few things for him in London because he's in Beirut. 1 million demonstrators, George. I don't think that's ever been achieved, has it?
Well, we had between 1 million and 2 million in Hyde Park on February 15th, 2003, which was 20 times bigger than the next biggest demonstration there's ever been in Britain. And I believe that we're going to have 1 million on the streets of Manchester. It's a bold claim, James, and my colleagues in the anti-war movement may be a little nervous at my claiming it, but I have this sense that so many people, it's like critical mass as a scientific term, there's so many people now believe that it's time for Mr. Blair to go, that they'll want to do anything that they can to bring about the finality of a prime ministership that's been disastrous for Britain. I mean, we want rid of this prime minister, not just because what he's doing to other people, but because of what he's doing to us. He's making our country a more dangerous place to live in. He's endangering our interests. We once had very considerable interests in the Arab world and across the Muslim world. We were once respected, now we're hated, and our people are afraid to travel in many parts of the world as a result of this man's policies.
All right.
I spoke to some families recently who are worried about their children going off on gap years, where once they would have been happy to see their children traveling the world. They're now afraid for their children to go out in the world.
Okay. Now, George, we're going to take one more call, then a commercial break, and then I think you have a